Hi, I'm Brock Beerley, Tamara Studio Art double major student. This is Lie Groups. It's essentially a reformatting of a lecture I gave once. We're going to talk about memory, we're going to talk about math, some personal anecdotes, but I'd like to start with something I've been really fascinated by recently, which is the color temperature scale. This is used to measure what I guess you could call neutral light, and it's measured in Kelvin, so it really is a color temperature scale. Counterintuitively, as the Kelvin goes up, the light gets cooler because when a filament gets hotter and hotter, it actually becomes bluer. 6,500 degrees is basically right in the middle, pure white. You can go from some really orange, red looking light to some really icy lights that, in the right context, that could be considered white light. For example, this blank background you're looking at, you might think is pure white, but it's actually 6,270 degrees Kelvin, which is on the warmer side. And it's hard to notice these things until they're in contrast. And I've been messing around within my art a little bit, and I think there's just something kind of poignant about it for me. And we'll come back to this, but I want to connect this to a story, which is I make and perform music, and oftentimes those performances are house shows, and oftentimes those house shows are in basements. There was one basement show about a year and a half ago in which I was performing with a band, and I was in some usual stage hysterics, and I accidentally knocked over a keyboard stand, which toppled over a microphone stand. And my bandmate helped swing it back up, and it swung smack dab into my teeth. And so I looked like this for a minute, and I was running between dentists and endodontists, getting root canals and stuff. Eventually, when it came down to finally replacing the tooth, it was going to be made out of porcelain. And there was a lot of remolding and sending back to the lab and shaving down and stuff. And after, I don't know, maybe 8 tries, they finally got it. And I'm really happy to say that I am successfully Bluetooth integrated. Speaking of transhumanism, there's this app called Memory OS, and I only briefly used it in its beta stages, but it was essentially pitched as a Duolingo adjacent app, but specifically for information retention, just general memory. And lessons were being taught by this memory champion, Jonas von Essen, who kind of looks like a scuffed version of me. It was interesting. It lined up very well with this fascination I had with this math phenomena, which let me tell you about that, and we'll come back to Memory OS. So I was in this class, this exco called I Hate Math Co, which, funnily enough, was almost entirely math majors. And every class we would talk about a different kind of counterintuitive math property or paradox or something. And one of them was the birthday problem. This problem is essentially that if you're in a room with a bunch of people, there's a certain probability that you'll have the same birthday as someone else. And it only takes 23 people for that probability to exceed 50%. And so we were asked to try and figure out why this is the case. And so I got to work, and I was kind of going in this studio art approach, drawing this symbol I already really liked to draw, which was kind of already based around this idea of probabilities, of connecting nodes, all possible connections between these circles, like just linear connections. And I noticed that each row of connections decreased by 1, and the amount of rows of connections was 1 less than the amount of nodes you have. And I got really excited because this seemed like a perfect analog for the idea of sharing a birthday with someone. And here's just some pictures. You can see that this idea extends to as many as you want. And through just scribbling down, trying to come up with some kind of function to map this on, I came up with n times n minus 1 over 2. In retrospect, I don't really think this proved anything. I think there might have just been some confirmation bias, and I was really excited by this idea that I just intuitively knew this, that I had it in me. I can't explain why there was something really moving to me about this function and this kind of diagram. I think this idea of a network of direct connections between two bodies each. There's something emotional about it to me in that it felt really relational. Yeah, it just felt really beautiful to me. It felt like there was this dialogue between like warm and cool knowledge of intuition and principles versus like information and lists and stuff like that. So I had this wrong answer and I was really pumped. So I kind of tunneled into looking up this function and seeing what other places it shows up in. And I found this Wikipedia page, indefinite orthogonal group. This has to do with discrete math, abstract algebra, whatever you call it, which was something that seemed interesting to me already just from the descriptions of the math haters in the class. And the function I was interested in surfaced as the dimension of this group. I didn't really know what that meant. So I posed a challenge to myself, which was I would read this Wikipedia article and work through each term I didn't know until I understood this idea of this indefinite orthogonal group. This may seem kind of ridiculous since it almost feels like kind of a dead-end topic from already a specific subsect of math, and I was in the I Hate Math Exco. Spoiler alert, I like math. I just kind of fell behind. So this was some supposed redemption arc I was seeing before myself. And I was in a performance art class, and this seemed like the perfect project to me. For those of you wondering how Lie group plays into this Wikipedia article, an indefinite orthogonal group is actually a Lie group, which is a group that is also a differentiable manifold, in case you were wondering. So I had this challenge posed to myself, and I got to work, just did a cold read, took note of any words or phrases I didn't really understand.
Preserves a sesquilinear form of signature, P and Q. In even dimension, n equals 2p, O of pp is known as the split orthogonal group. So here's what I don't know.
I got to a point where it seemed like this project required a time commitment that did not match my time frame. I would have to build a pyramid of knowledge of sorts, starting really wide in this completely new way of thinking about math. And so I decided to switch pedagogies and started looking on YouTube for a spoken lesson about this stuff, preferably in English so I could play Run 3 at the same time. And I happened upon this channel, Socratica. Socratica seemed to translate the kind of see also impenetrability of a lot of math for stressed out students, what have you.
To begin, imagine you live on an alien planet where each day is 7 hours long.
And sweetened the deal with this delightfully chuggy host teacher.
The first time you hear the definition of group, you may think to yourself, it's an abstract idea.
She is often wearing a silk shirt. She's often in front of like a picture day background. And she seems so comfortably familiar with these subjects, almost like an old friend. And it made getting into abstract algebra really exciting, actually. I ended up pausing Run 3 just to watch these videos. The host of these videos, whom I'm just going to call Socratica because she doesn't seem to disclose her name, I really envied her relationship or projected relationship to these math concepts because she seemed to spill out quips and have this really hard knocks, practical understanding of some really abstract stuff. And looking back, I'm sure this was the fruits of a lot of hard, long hours poring over a book in candlelight or whatever. And I started to wonder, was there a way to combine these really airtight teachings on Socratica with this kind of feeling of math that I felt with the birthday paradox? Could I feel what an indefinite orthogonal group was by kind of putting myself in Socratica's shoes? And so I decided to start memorizing these videos in the abstract algebra playlist. I was kind of thinking of this endeavor as like an inverse Pierre Menard scenario, in which I accrue life experiences through a faithful recreation of some work. And for me, that was going to be these 33 Socratica videos. This is where Memory OS comes into play. This app, I was using it in the beta stages. It was really strange. There were these video lessons that felt kind of old-fashioned, in which this memory champion, Jonas von Essen, teaches you about his methods for remembering a lot of shit. And it's kind of like mnemonic devices times 100, where you just make insane associations in a chain to remember things. And this was framed as like hacking your brain or like some kind of enhancement to your brain, Memory OS. And it seemed to work for me. I was getting all the answers right. I really didn't care about this Mind Palace thing, this like VR. I don't know. There's just something that's very anachronistic in the other way. Like, this was like fake future. Like, oh, you're going to have your 3D Mind Palace. Whatever. So yeah, I started using Memory OS to memorize these Socratica videos to try and get a deeper understanding of abstract algebra. Here's the intro lesson that I was greeted with on Memory OS beta.
Welcome to the first lesson in this course. In this lesson, I'm going to take you through a small exercise in order to give you an idea about how these memory techniques work, and also hopefully to show you that they work. So let's dive right into it. I'd like you to imagine that the top of your head is removable. You can lift up the top of your head, and when you do that, you find a smaller version of your head inside. And then you can of course also lift up the top of that head and find an even smaller version of the head inside there, and so on. So it's like one of these Russian dolls where you get smaller and smaller versions all the time, but in this case with your head as the model. So just try to imagine this in some way. And then I'd also like you to visualize that out of each of your ears there's a big red maple leaf growing. Okay, so 2 big red maple leaves are growing out of your ears. Just try to picture this. And finally, I'd like you to imagine that you've replaced one of your eyes with a hamburger. Instead of one of your eyes, you have a hamburger in that eye socket. Try to see this as clearly as you can, even though you have a hamburger in one of your eyes. Great. Maybe this felt quite useless, pointless, but actually you can use this exercise to remember the order of the 3 largest countries in the world by surface area.
Suppose we have a group which we call G. This is a very common name for groups since, well, groups start with the letter G. Hey, don't ever say that mathematicians aren't creative. A subgroup of G is a subset that is also a group. A common letter used for a subgroup is H since, well, H comes after G in the alphabet. Hey, don't ever say that mathematicians aren't predictable. To avoid writing words, there's a math symbol to indicate that H is a subgroup of G. That's right, the less than or equal sign is used to say H is a subgroup of G. This notation is used to suggest that H is a smaller group than G. When you read this aloud, you would say H is a subgroup of G. You would not say H is less than or equal to G. I mean, technically, G is a subgroup of itself, so that's why we use the less than or equal to symbol. It's not a very interesting subgroup, but a subgroup just the same.
Suppose we have a group which we call G. This is a very common name for groups since, well, groups start with the letter G. Hey, don't ever say that mathematicians aren't creative. A subgroup of G is a subset that is also a group. A common letter used for a subgroup is H, since, well, H comes after G in the alphabet. Hey, don't ever say mathematicians aren't predictable. To avoid writing words, there's a math symbol used to indicate that H is a subgroup of G. That's right, the less than or equal sign is used to say H is a subgroup of G. This notation is used to suggest that H is a smaller group than G. When you read this aloud, you would say H is a subgroup of G. You would not say H is less than or equal to G. No. Technically, G is a subgroup of itself, so that's why we use the less than or equal to symbol. It's not a very interesting subgroup, but a subgroup just the same.
Quite amazing, right? And how does this work? Well, Basically, you could say that your memory is made up of connections. In order to learn something new, you have to connect it to things that you already know. And memory techniques is a lot about making these connections as strong as possible. In general, you could say that the more abstract the things that you want to remember are, the more difficult it is to make really strong connections between them. While on the other hand, if you have very clear and concrete things, it's relatively easy to connect them. So what we've been doing in this exercise is taking something relatively abstract, like Argentina and the 8th largest country in the world, and connected these pieces of information by turning them into a much more concrete connection, namely that between a pirate and your belly button. If you've ever thought about the idea of having a pirate living in your belly button, that makes a connection that is so strong that it's almost impossible to forget. So this is the basic principle behind these techniques, making as clear and interesting connections as possible, which will make you remember almost anything that you want with some training. Of course, there are a lot of more things to say about this, but now you've got a small taste of